I think on the positive side of the ledger, important to recall the near universality of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Granted, there are a few important exceptions, but it is the case that the NPT today has either 190 or 191 members, depending upon how one counts the DPRK, which announced its decision to withdraw, that it's a decision to withdraw from the NPT that not all states parties accepts. Another generally recognized positive development was the extension of the NPT indefinitely in 1965, which included a package of decisions and one resolution. The other decisions being the one having to do with the so-called strength and review process and the principles and objectives for nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament, as well as a key resolution on the Middle East. And so when we start talking about the NPT review conference later today, both with the president-designate and also another panel later in the week that I'll have the opportunity to partake in with, again, with Gustavo Slavin and others, it's useful to recall what was done in '95 because some of those decisions continue to impact on the current situation. The sixth point I'd make is that, in my view, nuclear weapons-free zones are among the most important but overlooked approaches for promoting both disarmament and non-proliferation. As those of you at this conference certainly know, the entire Southern Hemisphere is nuclear weapons-free. And with the entry into force of the Central Asian Nuclear Weapons-Free Zone in 2009, zones now also extend into the Northern Hemisphere. Having been involved in the negotiation of the Central Asian Zone, I'd love to speak more about that, but I'm going to refrain from doing so as there will be a separate lecture dealing with nuclear weapons-free zones. Moving faster, I'll simply mention that the entry into force of the New START Treaty in 2010, the last U.S.-Russian arms control accord, is important. And if there are questions regarding that, we may want to talk about it in the Q&A. Something that is often not included in a list of major non-proliferation developments, but I think deserves mention, was the April 2010 Nuclear Security Summit communique and work plan, which I regard as significant then and today, because first it showed a growing international recognition that a nuclear terrorist incident anywhere is a threat everywhere. Secondly, because it brought together an unusually diverse group of states to the table, states that are rarely around the table, but more so in this instance, were able to forge a consensus agreement. And those states were Algeria, Egypt, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, among others. They were able to sign off on an accord, a program of work, which was quite important. And thirdly, it was important because there was a focus on the human factor, not simply on guns, gates, and guards, the so-called 3Gs, but on the role of individuals, which I think is key to nuclear security, their mindset, how they approach the problem. Moving forward, many people, myself included, regard the May 2010 NPT Review Conference to be one of the most successful past conferences, in part because there were 22 action items dealing with disarmament, part of the 64 action items that were adopted by consensus. There were important recommendations on the Middle East, which of course were not realized, but nevertheless there were an agreement on these recommendations. There was an important action item dealing with disarmament and non-proliferation education, the first time such a statement appeared in a review conference document, action item 22. But most important, and I would argue most relevant for today, was the fact that many of the key states at this conference demonstrated flexibility. It was a compromise document, but it could only take place because of the flexibility shown by many parties. And we're going to need that flexibility if we're going to have anything resembling a consensus document next year. A major point I think most of you are already familiar with was the new disarmament initiative related to the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. I've written a lot about this, but here all I have time to say is that the politics surrounding the initiative and the resulting treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons are exceptionally complex, with many storylines, characters, and subplots, much like Kurosawa's famous film Rashomon, where the heroes and the villains look very different depending on the vantage point of the individual, be it a nuclear weapons possessor, a U.S. alliance member, other non-nuclear weapon states, advocates of nuclear weapons abolition, or proponents of nuclear deterrence. So I think during the course of your summer school, it's going to be important for you to try to engage in something that's very difficult. That is to kind of see through the eyes of others, to have some empathy and to examine how this very significant treaty looks to different parties in different parts of the world. And last but not least on my short list of positive developments was the negotiation of the comprehensive nuclear deal with Iran, known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JCPOA. In my view, it was a remarkable achievement, even if it has now been gutted by what I regard to be the foolhardy withdrawal by the United States from that treaty. So let me turn now to the debit side of the ledger. Unfortunately, the positive developments that I've mentioned, and they're less than half of what I would normally provide you if I had more time for my presentation. Those developments have largely been overshadowed by a wave of bad proliferation news. Again, in the interest of time, I'm just going to limit my remarks to some of the more important disasters, if you will, in the non-proliferation domain. First, I mentioned something that is, I think, apparent to most, and that is the Indian and Pakistani nuclear tests in 1998. That's obvious. But I think what is, in some respects, more important but less obvious is the lack of a strong and sustained international response to them. People said something, for the most part, immediately after the tests, but it was then back to business as usual. It was striking to me that the tests were conducted immediately after the 1998 PrepCom in Geneva. At that subsequent review conference in 2000, hardly any mention was given to India and Pakistan. That, I think, is significant because it showed that people could, with impunity, test with very few consequences. Another failure is the failure to convene the 2010 NPT-mandated WMD-free zone conference in the Middle East, or even to set a date for the meeting. And we saw then the subsequent collapse of that process at the 2015 NPT review conference. And then in Geneva in 2018, we saw the US, I think very unwisely, basically indicate that it no longer would abide by the recommendations from 2010 with respect to the WMD-free zone, and it even raised questions about the standing of the 1995 resolution on the Middle East. A third debit is clearly the nuclear brinkmanship displayed by the DPRK, having conducted tests in 2006, 2009, 2013, 2016, two tests, and 2017, as well as the decision to defect from the NPT. Importantly, the only such decision that we have in the NPT's history. Something that I wish I had more time to speak to, because I've written several books on this topic, has to do with the continued danger of nuclear terrorism. When I first published a book around 2005, I called it The Four Faces of Nuclear Terrorism, having to do with the dangers of attacks on our sabotage of nuclear facilities, the potential for non-state actors to build crude but real nuclear devices, so-called improvised nuclear devices, the dangers posed by dirty bombs, so-called dirty bombs, the dispersion of radioactive debris from various sources, and also the potential theft or seizure of intact nuclear weapons. I think all of those risks remain very consequential. But what I had ignored in that initial book was the danger of a fifth form of terrorism, which I think is important and has received practically no attention. And that's what I call spoofing. And I'm not sure how to translate that into Spanish or Portuguese, but the basic idea is that, well, let me give you an example of what I mean. In 1995, there was a scientific experiment on the coast of Norway involving the launch of a scientific or sounding rocket. It was a multi-stage rocket. And when it was launched, it was initially interpreted by Russian command and control as a submarine-launched ballistic missile from the United States, which was not that absurd an interpretation given the characteristics of this missile. Fortunately, this took place at a time of reasonably good US-Russian relations, and President Yeltsin is alleged to have said, "My good friend Bill would never have done this to me." And after a short period of confusion, in fact, there was no Russian response. It was recognized to have been a mistake on the Russian radar. But one could imagine what would have happened had there been a dozen such missile launches. And these are missiles that are relatively inexpensive. They could have been purchased on eBay, these scientific rockets. And so you can see the potential for kind of disinformation precipitating an attack. What I find so disturbing about this today at a time where there is no trust, no empathy, and no respect between a number of nuclear weapon states, including the United States and Russia, is that a non-state actor, if it so chose, might be in a position to precipitate this kind of an attack with unforeseeable consequences. One could add to that kind of scenario the use of cyber means to also precipitate an attack. So I want to suggest that even though we have been very fortunate, I would say lucky, not to have experienced a significant episode of nuclear terrorism, we can't rule it out, and it could in fact be existential in nature, particularly if one were to engage in spoofing. Another failure that I have to mention is the failure of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty to enter into force. I think this issue becomes even more significant today, given hints by the United States that it may wish to resume testing. I think if we're to do so, one would see quick responses in Russia and China, among other places. A sixth point has to do with the rapid downward spiral in US-Russian cooperation for nuclear nonproliferation. This is particularly tragic in my mind, given the high level of cooperation that persisted even during the most frigid moments of the Cold War. It was the case in the past that notwithstanding their military rivalries and ideological differences, that after the Cuban Missile Crisis and after the NPT entered into force, by and large, the United States and the Soviet Union, and for a period of time, the United States and the Russian Federation, cooperated in the sphere of nuclear nonproliferation. That cooperation now is essentially gone. Something that we've talked already quite a bit about in the course is the issue of importance of education. And I think that's vital because I would add to my list of negative features widespread ignorance and complacency on the part of the public at large, their elected officials, and many parties to the NPT. So in order to combat ignorance and complacency, we must rely upon education and training. Another potential problem has to do with further NPT defections. I mentioned that the DPRK is the only case to date to have announced its decision to defect. But there are other kinds of defections that have been talked about in the past, even by some of the countries in this room. I mean, both Mexico and Brazil on occasion have indicated that they might wish to leave the treaty, not because they were interested in pursuing nuclear weapons, but because of symbolic reasons, to demonstrate their perception that not enough was being done to implement Article 6 of the treaty with respect to nuclear disarmament. Today, we have real concerns about, many people have real concerns about the nuclear weapons activities in Iran. Others are pointing the finger at Saudi Arabia. Egypt is a country of concern for some. But there are also other countries that one might call conditional perspective defections, such as South Korea and Japan. And here, the big question mark in the nuclear calculus is how these states perceive the security guarantees that have long served them, they believe well, by the United States. Given comments by the current administration, sometimes suggesting the desirability or the likelihood of nuclear proliferation because of decreased credibility of U.S. alliance guarantees. So the issue of proliferation and defections remains a real one. I'm getting pretty close to the end of my list here, Jean, so I think I still have sufficient time here. I would add as a major disappointment the very dysfunctional 2015 NPT review conference. There were all kinds of things that went wrong, which I could recount at great length, and I've also written about it in an article in Survival. But here I would just mention there was the absence of bridge building coalitions. There was really very little effort to find common ground promoted by regional and political groupings. I think there was a lack of presidential leadership, and there was an unwillingness on the part of most states to compromise. This lack of flexibility was pronounced even among so-called like-minded states within the non-aligned movement, and was most evident at the Third International Conference on Nuclear Weapons-Free Zones, which some of you even may have attended, but was notable for its failure to even be able to agree to adopt any statement. In fact, it so infuriated the president of the conference from Indonesia that temporarily, at least, Indonesia said that it would no longer serve as chair of the NAM group on disarmament. They felt as if they had been betrayed by their NAM members. So an awful lot of things went wrong, were dysfunctional, and hopefully as we get moving toward the next review conference, we'll see a much better leadership. We'll see more collaboration. We'll see more bridge building coalitions, and hopefully that will make a difference. I think the reversal of U.S.-Russian cooperation for non-proliferation also is linked to what we are now seeing as a significant U.S.-Russian nuclear arms race. And there's a potential for a similar race now involving the United States and China, which will be harrowing if in fact it transpires. Another major problem, and one which I wish I could speak to at greater length, is what many people refer to as the U.S.-India nuclear deal that was initiated in 2005, and the Nuclear Suppliers Group exemption that was consummated in September 2008. I cite these as particularly negative proliferation developments because a number of the other challenges that we face are almost beyond our control. But in the case of the U.S.-India nuclear deal and the NSG exemption, this was a form of self-inflicted punishment. In my view, it was a form of collective amnesia on the part of both nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states, which had the effect of diminishing the value of non-nuclear weapons states within the NPT by granting privileges to a nuclear weapons possessor that were not provided to non-nuclear weapons states parties to the NPT. It was contrary to the politically binding paragraph 12 in the 1995 Principles and Objectives decision from the Review and Extension Conference, I think it did damage to the credibility of the non-aligned movement and other countries that see themselves as champions of disarmament and non-proliferation, because basically it made it difficult for these states to accuse the nuclear weapon states of cherry-picking those aspects of past agreements that they liked while they were doing the same thing themselves. And it's particularly troublesome, and it's important for me to make this point to many members of a major nuclear weapons-free zone, the first populated nuclear weapons-free zone, or zone in a populated area, because 3 nuclear weapons-free zones, Pelindaba, Rarotonga, and my own favorite, the Central Asia Nuclear Weapons-Free Zone, all have states who are acting contrary to their legally binding prohibitions about providing nuclear assistance to countries that don't have either full scope safeguards in place, or in the Central Asian zone also the additional protocol. And yet no zone, including no one from Tlatelolco, is prepared to speak out and criticize these countries for their behavior. The last 3 points I'll make, and then I think we still have a little bit of time for Q&A. One, I would, in my attempt to be provocative, but in a non-discriminatory fashion, I would not only accuse my own country of all kinds of misbehavior, but I also would point to the blatant disregard by Russia of the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, action which I think served to undermine international law and the integrity of the decisions by, in particular by Ukraine, to join the NPT as a non-nuclear weapons state. I think you may wish to talk later in the course about something that we haven't had a chance to discuss very much, even in the NPT context, at NPT meetings, and that's the rise of new disruptive technologies, be it cyber, additive manufacturing, advanced conventional weapons, autonomous weapon systems, drones. These are very, very important new technologies which may have many benefits, but also pose major risks in terms of strategic stability, among others, for non-proliferation and disarmament. And finally, and probably appropriately as an American speaking at this important forum, I think one has to address the impact of US policies on the NPT. In balance, I think US behavior in the last 3.5 years in the non-proliferation realm, and certainly in the disarmament realm, have been absolutely disastrous. I think we've displayed a total disinterest in multilateral diplomacy and international organizations, including the CTBTO and the UN. We've pushed for new nuclear weapon systems, much greater defense spending. We've walked away from the important Iran deal, the JCPOA. I think by our behavior, and behavior which in some respects corresponds to US behavior, and here I'm talking about the Russian behavior, there's increased risk of nuclear first use and the danger of use by accident and miscalculation. I think these are tremendously troubling developments, and I think they bode well, or rather bode poorly, for non-proliferation generally, and make it much more difficult for us to make headway at the next review conference. So that's my 30-minute version of what is normally a 90-minute presentation. But why don't I stop at that point, Jean, because I've tried to be provocative. I've skipped over lots of points, and I would be pleased to hear from some of our participants if they have questions or wish to make comments.
Thank you very much, Dr. Potter. And so while I am inviting participants to, if you wish to ask Dr. Potter questions or make comments, including those panelists that are still online, I invite you to do so. The way to signal that you wish to ask a question is please raise the little hand icon next to your name, and I will recognize the participants in the order that I see them, and then we'll turn on your microphone if you wish to ask the question in person. You can also type the question into the Q&A. That way, Dr. Potter can see the question as well. While people consider questions, Bill, I've heard this talk in a variety of ways over the years, and I want to inform or remind the participants that it actually provides a good menu of the threats for them to discuss in the breakout session on the 14th or the 16th and 17th of July, which we hope to find solutions to some of the threats that you presented. But I was struck that over the years, your scale of the good, the bad, and the ugly have moved to the ugly. And I think the ugly side is heavily loaded. In the absence of questions that I see at the moment, well, hold on, let me just see. There's a question from Ricardo Vivas. What are the standards of the current non-proliferation relations between the United States and China?
In the NPT context, I would say they are definitely evolving. For the most part, in the recent PrepComs that I've attended, those being 17, 18, and 19, one did not observe the very toxic kinds of exchanges between China and the United States that one saw almost on a daily basis through the so-called right of reply involving Russia and the United States. So there was at least, I think, a more restrained public perspective displayed in the formal statements and exchanges in the PrepCom. I think there has been a hope that the P5 process, this process in which the 5 permanent members of the Security Council meet to try to develop common positions with respect to disarmament, that might yield a joint statement. And in my view, the Chinese in the NPT meetings have been, quite restrained, and so they have not kind of baited the Americans in the same manner that the Russians have. But of course, one has to take note of recent developments, and I think that does not bode well for Sino-American relations at the next review conference. But this is a good point, maybe also to mention the importance of individuals, personalities. And so there have been occasions when senior figures in the American and Russian delegations have kind of played to each other's worst aspects of their personalities. They have kind of engaged in vitriolic language, which not surprisingly has led to similarly vitriolic responses. That has not been the case, at least in the public sessions of the debate that I've noticed. It's more difficult for me to know what's going on behind the scenes. So I think we may experience more problems in terms of the Sino-American relationship publicly as a consequence of the general deterioration in relations, but I don't think it's nearly as bad or has reached the stage of the U.S.-Russian relationship. You may want to ask that same question of Ambassador Zavanin, or Undersecretary Zavanin, who has been consulting, I'm sure, with many of the key parties, and he has to be more diplomatic than do I, but he may give you a better sense of that relationship.
Thank you, Bill. We have another question. I will ask Luis Enrique if you wish to ask the question. Luis, yes.
Yes, hi, thank you. Well, my question is a bit broad. I just wish to know if it's realistic in a very long run, in hundreds of years, to expect that only a handful of countries will have nuclear weapons, or is the ultimate goal of non-proliferation simply to slow down the pace and push forward the date where most countries will have access to this technology?
Well, I mean, I can give you my own kind of personal take here. I mean, and you ask a question with a very optimistic kind of assumption. You're talking about hundreds of years from now, and so that in itself suggests a world with a future that I wish I could embrace. I'm more concerned about the next 6 months rather than 100 years from now, because I do really think that there are existential threats that confront us today in a fashion that we've never faced before. And so, I'm very much concerned about the spread of nuclear weapons to other countries, because I think the more countries that have nuclear weapons, the greater the use. I'm concerned about the potential for non-state actors also having access to or an opportunity to influence the use of nuclear weapons, which I see as a grave danger. But in addition, I'm particularly concerned about what some have referred to as vertical proliferation. That is, increasing the arsenals and developing new nuclear doctrines involving those countries that currently possess nuclear weapons. And so I'm actually, at this moment in time, probably more concerned with the element of vertical proliferation than horizontal proliferation, although they are interrelated. I think my concern here is fundamentally a concern about the dangers less of intentional use and more the potential for kind of stumbling and bumbling into the inadvertent escalation of a conflict in which nuclear weapons are actually employed. And that is really a question having to do with the state of political relations between countries, the lack of respect for one another, the total inability to understand and empathize, and I would say the total lack of trust. I've never seen that before. Even in the worst moments, I'm old enough to recall the Cuban Missile Crisis as a junior high school student. Even at that moment in time, when the United States and the Soviet Union were kind of eye to eye, it was said one side blinked, there was, I think, greater respect, more interaction than we have today between Washington and Moscow. And so it's that possible use by due to miscalculation, misperception, accident that worries me most. So that's why I'm sorry for the long kind of preface, but that's why when you're talking about what the world will look like several hundred years from now, I see that as a very kind of optimistic scenario. I hope we have the opportunity to observe that. I think that I pointed to the fact that proliferation is not a one-way street, and we've seen some very significant instances of renunciation of nuclear weapons for both domestic and international political reasons. And I think it's not out of the question that we may see more of that. On the other hand, I fear that to the extent that those current nuclear weapons possessors treat nuclear weapons as something terribly important for their national security policies, that other countries will learn from that. They'll emulate it, and it will make it much more difficult to get rid of nuclear weapons. So I'm not one who believes that we are on the cusp of a major proliferation of weapons, because I think that security policies, the security scene is not the only thing that drives nuclear proliferation. There are a lot of domestic economic and domestic political factors. So I don't see rampant proliferation around the corner, but I do fear that it is conceivable that countries which in the past have acted in a prudent fashion may begin to question security guarantees and may see more political value in weapons than they have in the recent past, and that makes me worried. I hope that addresses at least some aspects of your question.
Thank you, Bill. We have a number of more questions. I have two individuals, and I would ask everyone who asks a question, please identify yourself and your country. It'd be interesting to know where you're from. We have a question from William Pierre, and also a question from Andrew Rogers. So, William Pierre, I will give you the floor. William? Okay. His question, Bill, was, what is the future of non-proliferation and nuclear disarmament for Latin American and the Caribbean regarding the course for nuclear weapons that actually take place all around the world? And then the second question that's related to that is from Jewel Young. Do you foresee the sanctions for disarmament ultimately, oh no, I beg your pardon, not from Jewel Young, it's from Andrew Rogers. What role do you see small island states developing, playing in the advancement of nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation efforts? So one question regarding what's the future of disarmament for the Latin American states, and more specifically, what role can small island states play in advancing nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation?
I'm much more optimistic about the both proliferation, non-proliferation, and disarmament in Latin America than I am in most other regions. I think that, as was evident in the meetings that led to the negotiation of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, that Latin America and the Caribbean acted in a collective manner in a fashion that really wasn't replicated anywhere else. And so I think there was this, broad and deep commitment to disarmament that was manifest, and I saw that as very positive. I think it's also important to note that Latin America and the Caribbean remain one of the few regions where there is no longer any highly enriched uranium present. And so those are major steps toward a nuclear weapons-free world. And I think this island, if you will, of Latin America and the Caribbean is a model in that regard. So I'm encouraged by progress that has been made in Latin America and the Caribbean. I think, size of a country is not very well correlated to the impact on non-proliferation and disarmament policy in international deliberations. It's more a question of the priority that a country gives to a particular issue. And I've long argued with my friends in Central Asia and also with friends in other parts of the world, including Latin America, that there are opportunities for a country, even with a relatively small diplomatic corps, to choose an issue, to invest in that issue, to make that issue a salient one in the different negotiating fora in which your country participates. And so Disarmament, non-proliferation education is a case in point. There are very few countries, surprisingly few countries, that have chosen to emphasize this. So if you develop expertise, if you build allies, if you work with regional and political groupings, I think you can have an impact far beyond the size of your country. And that would apply to other areas, whether you were interested in export controls, whether you were interested in issues having to do with nuclear security, whether you are interested in dealing with disruptive technologies. If you select issues that are important to your country and you invest in training a cadre, and it can be a relatively small cadre of individuals, I think there's an opportunity to have a major impact on the international stage, because too many countries, I think, are not making that kind of investment. And so I would say there's a bright future.
Thank you. I'm going to call on Pablo Figuera from Guatemala and then Jules Young to ask their questions. Pablo, please go ahead.
Can you tell me, John, just before you do so, how much time do we have? Because I want to make sure that I know when I'm supposed to.
I think the session will end at 1:45.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah. Pablo.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Priest. And thank you very much also, Dr. Potter, for the presentation. This is Paulo Figueroa from Guatemala. I would like to ask you if you can explain a little bit more about the 5 phases of nuclear terrorism that you mentioned before, and if there is an antecedent of this act. Thank you.
What was the last part? If there's a, what was the
antecedent of this act?
So I think the 5 phases of nuclear terrorism, which is one more than I had in the book title, encompass essentially all of the conceivable kind of broad categories of nuclear terrorist action. Initially, I was much more concerned with what I saw as low probability, but very severe forms of terrorism having to do with the fabrication and detonation of so-called crude nuclear devices, which I thought was within the range of the possible for a non-state actor. And the potential to kind of seize or purchase an intact nuclear weapon, probably a non-strategic or tactical nuclear weapon because they were smaller and more portable. Today, I am concerned about that potential, but I'm even more concerned about non-state actors engaging in terrorist activities having to do with the dispersal of radioactive devices, or radioactive material, because of the widespread availability of radioactive material in every country of the world. I mean, we know of a number of cases of missing materials that were stolen in Mexico, for example. There's a famous case involving Brazil. Almost every country has enormous numbers of what people refer to as orphan radiological sources. These are sources that were used for civilian purposes, but there were poor inventories that were kept. And so large quantities of these materials that could be used for nefarious purposes are still out there and I think need to be recovered. And I'm also very much concerned about the potential for attacks on or sabotage of nuclear facilities. And again, these are not theoretical cases. There are a number of cases, including in South Africa, John, where non-state actors did in fact take direct action to sabotage nuclear facilities. I think those are very real risks. But to reiterate the point that I made earlier in my when I was talking about the balance sheet, it's very difficult to think of actions that a non-state actor or a terrorist organization might undertake that would actually lead to the end of the world as we know it. Even if they were to acquire 1 or 2 small nuclear weapons, or were able to unleash a whole series of improvised nuclear devices or radiological dispersal devices or attack on number of facilities. It could cause horrendous damage, economic, social, and physical damage, but they would not be existential threats. Ironically, I think the greatest potential to impact on the world as we know it in an existential form would not require access to nuclear material weapons at all. It really would only require deceiving and precipitating a nuclear exchange by those countries that have very large nuclear arsenals. And so I think we have to be much more concerned about that. And what I find so worrisome, knowing people in my own government who are supposed to be working on issues in a very classified manner, my impression is that this is not something that's on their radar screen. I worry about how this might play out in South Asia, where you have 2 contiguous countries with significant nuclear arsenals. There may be parties who would not like to see a rapprochement between those countries and might take it upon themselves to precipitate what could become a nuclear exchange. So those are some of the risks that I'm most worried about today in the nuclear sphere.
Thank you, Bill. We have 5 more questions and we have limited time. So I suggest that I'm going to ask 2 questioners to ask their questions, one following the other, and then allow Dr. Potter to respond, and then the other 3. These are rather provocative questions. So first I will ask Carmen Ravala to ask her question. And then also Sonia Sarmiento. So I will ask Carmen to ask her question. Just a minute, I'm trying to...
If you could tell me their countries too, just out of curiosity.
So, Carmen, I do not know where she is from, but I will ask her to introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. I'm Carmen or Montserrat. I'm a Mexican diplomat, currently based in Honduras at the Mexican Embassy. Dr. Potter, thank you very much for your presentation. You mentioned that US policies do have an impact on the NPT, and I would ask you if you could elaborate a bit more on this, and particularly to give us your insights on what, what effects or what could be the potential consequences of President Trump's re-election, if that happens, that could have on nuclear weapons disarmament and non-proliferation processes. Thank you very much.
And then, Bill, I would ask Patricia Munoz to ask her question. Patricia? No. Yeah. Patricia. Since she is not responding, I will read the question. In your opinion, what should the role of the United Nations be under the possibility of US resuming nuclear testing?
Okay, thank you, Jean. Let me address kind of US policy, and as I think is already obvious, I'm not a spokesperson for the US government, but as far removed from a spokesperson from the US government as one could imagine. As I have said to some of my friends, and having written books on forecasting, proliferation, I don't put much credence in the ability of experts to forecast. But I must say, I find myself much more comfortable forecasting US non-proliferation policy because all one really has to do, in my mind, regrettably, is to think of the worst possible course of action that one could imagine. And almost inevitably, that's the course of action that the current administration pursues. Many people tended to attribute much of this bad behavior to John Bolton when he was the principal national security advisor to the president. And at the time, that was rather logical because Mr. Bolton had a philosophy which you might not like, and I certainly didn't like, but it was internally very consistent. And it was a policy that basically said the U.S. will never support any accord, any treaty, any agreement, if it in any way limits U.S. flexibility of action, even if that accord might serve U.S. national security interests, such as the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, or the INF Treaty, or the New START Treaty, and you can expand the list. And so the inclination was to withdraw from, disavow, certainly not engage in new negotiations, because almost by definition, a treaty is a compromise. And so there is some freedom of action that one surrenders for the kind of the greater good of your security and presumably the security of others. Unfortunately, the departure of Mr. Bolton has not led to an abandonment of that approach. In fact, we see it even more pronounced in many respects. And so I see that as tremendously damaging to the role that the U.S. can play constructively in the NPT review process or any other process for that matter. And I think a good example of how this has played out was the decision that I mentioned earlier in Geneva in 2018, when the U.S. basically repudiated the accord that they had, or the consensus position that had been negotiated in 2010 with respect to the Middle East. They said the international security conditions had changed, and so they were prepared to change their policy. And the problem is, if the U.S. takes that stance, every country, every state party to the NPT can make a similar argument that past political obligations are no longer relevant because the world has changed. But if that's the case, what's the purpose of an NPT negotiation? You meet for 4 weeks to negotiate a consensus document, and the ink is no longer dry. The day after, you're back in your capital or in Geneva, and you act contrary to what you've negotiated. So I see that as just, it's an impossible starting point. You have to ask, what's the purpose of the NPT negotiations if that's the position, if past commitments no longer matter. So I find that, tremendously discouraging. I'm at a loss, actually, as to what any international body can do if the U.S. is foolhardy enough to actually resume nuclear testing. Because I think what's going to happen is that there are institutional actors in a number of other states where there are nuclear weapons present, who will argue that much as they did not want to resume testing, they cannot stand idly by if the U.S. tests. And so I suspect that in China, in Russia, in India, in Pakistan, among others, there would be tremendous pressure to follow suit. So I'm sure this is something that would need to be discussed in the Security Council, but I fear that it would be very difficult to control if that point is crossed. So that bridge is going to cross. So I very much hope that we don't have to see that very, very unfortunate development transpire. I think that's probably all I can say at the moment, John.
That's a tough one, Bill. Thank you. We have three more questions, and with the agreement of Ambassador Sloverdien, I will ask the following three to ask your questions. The first, and please identify your country. First is Jewel Young, and then Sonia Sarmiento, and Alina Canas. And I will ask you in that order, ask your questions, and for Dr. Potter to respond as he sees fit. So, Jewel Young, you have the floor. Jewel? All right, I don't see Jewel coming on. Her question, Bill, is do you foresee the sanctions for disarmament ultimately ceasing the expansion of nuclear armaments proliferation in North Korea? And then I will ask Sonia Sarmiento to ask her question. Sonia? Okay, she's not coming online. Her question is, thank you for your presentation. Oh, she's online. Sonia, do you want to ask your question?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dupuis. Thank you, Dr. Potter. I am from Bolivia. I am working at the Division for Disarmament at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in my country. I want to know what do you think about the position of the nuclear weapon states would be if the nuclear weapon ban treaty entered into force? Thank you very much.
Thank you. And then the last question of the session from Alina Canas. Alina, if you are online, please ask your question. Alina? Yes.
Good
Alina,
morning.
go ahead.
Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. There you are.
Thank you.
Oh, okay.
Thank you very much for organizing this summer school and for your interesting remarks, Mr. Porter. You spoke about obstacles to the creation of a nuclear weapon free zone in the Middle East. So I was wondering if there's any chance of making progress in this area. I know the panorama nowadays is very pessimistic, but I was wondering, what do you think about it, if there's any chance of making something positive, and if so, how? Thank you.
Alina is from Costa Rica.
Okay, nice to see you, Alina. Give my best to Elaine White when you have a chance. These are all very, difficult questions. I'm sure you're saving all the easy questions for Gustavo in the next session, and he may want to weigh in here. I'm really reluctant to forecast anything with respect to the DPRK. I mean, it's hard enough to predict what's going on with respect to Iran, U.S.-Russia relations, Sino-American relations, but the DPRK remains very much, a black hole for me. I don't see sanctions having much of an impact at this stage. I'm not sure you can sanction much more than we've already sanctioned. So, but how this plays out is really, really very, very difficult to say. And as I think the New York Times put it yesterday, the pandemic is doing more in terms of sanctions than our sanctions policy, in terms of causing the country's economy to shrivel. But what that means in terms of policy behavior, I don't really know. With respect to the impact of the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons entering into force, it's also hard to anticipate. I would say it's one of the very few issues where the United States and the Russian Federation have similar views. I don't see much prospect for coordination of policy there. I think, most unfortunately, it will be very difficult for the review conference to find language that will accurately characterize the state of play with respect to the TPNW, including its possible entry into force. One might think that many countries would like to welcome that development. That certainly is not language that would be accepted by many of the nuclear weapon states and their allies. And the real question is whether you can have more neutral language that simply kind of notes or acknowledges the entry into force of the treaty. Unfortunately, some countries, including France in the past, have indicated that they're not even prepared to make that kind of acknowledgement. Now, it's possible that they may be isolated and that more flexibility is displayed by other countries. So I think at a minimum, one is going to have to acknowledge this important development. And I suspect that one of the things that states parties are doing at the moment, and maybe actually Mr. Zalvinin can say something about, work on how countries may be trying to draft language to take account of that development if it transpires. Finally, with respect to the WMD-free zone, again, it's very hard to anticipate. One of the positive developments from my standpoint was the outcome of the first meeting of the UN of the Middle East conference that was held at the United Nations this past November. I think its outcome was more successful than most people anticipated. They're scheduled to have a second meeting this fall. If that meeting also produces some movement, even in the absence of the United States and Israel, which didn't participate last time around, it's possible that there will be a perception of less urgency and an imperative on the part of Egypt and other states in the region to make the Middle East an issue at the review conference. To some extent, it's also going to be, what the United States says about the issue. So, I mean, at every NPT review conference that I've been to, the Middle East and a WMD-free zone or nuclear weapons-free zone in the region has been contentious. I suspect it will be contentious in the next review conference, but it's at least possible that having taken the zone out of the NPT to some extent may make it a little bit easier for states to avoid a confrontation on this issue at the next review conference. But again, that's a good question to ask of our president-designate.